Hello, welcome to another live Google Hangout on the Living Income Guaranteed. And today we are continuing with our discussions on the growing movements that are very interesting and bold ideas for humanity, specifically talking about permaculture, the growing food revolution. And we all know that food is a basic necessity, a fundamental human right. But if we look at the world, many people are actually going hungry, and there's probably a vast lack of awareness of how even our food is grown, where does it come from, or else. And in this movement, permaculture, there is the growing awareness of we can actually learn how to grow our own food and become sovereign in relation to being able to feed ourselves and not depend on corporations, for example. But it is not only growing food that is entailed within permaculture. It is a change in lifestyles, in values, in principles. So to talk about this, we will be interviewing Alex Razo from the UK. Hello, Alex. Welcome.
Hi, how are you doing?
Fine, thank you. Glad to have you here. And there is like an ongoing trend about permaculture. We hear a lot about it. Many deem it as a subversive movement because, in a way, once that you start growing your own food, it is like you're becoming more independent within the system. You can choose to, for example, not buy the GMO foods or foods that contain stuff that we don't even know exists. So there is this kind of consideration or definition of permaculture. So what can you tell us about it, as what it is, what are the basic principles, core values, etc.?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, you're certainly right. I think that in some circles, perhaps permaculture is regarded as something subversive, as something that is a kind of counterculture to our existing paradigm of sort of consumption, consumer-driven life, really, which is kind of being perpetuated across the world. There are many different definitions of permaculture. I can probably give just one that actually I quite like, if you're okay with that. It's by a guy called Bill Mollison, who's considered one of the founders of the theory of permaculture. Really, it was started by a guy called SelfHalsa, who was an Austrian farmer initially, Swiss, I think, and then kind of developed in theory after that. So practice and then theory. But Bill Mollison wrote a book called Introduction to Permaculture, and he said the aim is to create systems that are ecologically sound and economically viable, which provide for their own needs, do not exploit or pollute, and are therefore sustainable in the long term. Permaculture uses the inherent qualities of plants and animals combined with the natural characteristics of landscapes and structures to produce a life-supporting system for city and country using the smallest practical area. So that, for me, I like that quote because it grounds permaculture in a very practical approach to living, if you like. So in essence, it revolves around three core ethics, which try, in essence, guide how we do permaculture, how it happens, and what it is. And those three ethics are earth care, essentially care for the earth, care for the planet, our natural ecosystem, our life support system, effectively, which is just common sense, really. The second is people care, so obviously care for the human community, for each other, and for ourselves as well, equally. And then the third is fair share, and that can also be looked at in terms of return of surplus to the other two ethics. So any surplus that's created actually goes back either to the earth or to the human community to be used effectively. So in that sense, it's very simple, and where those three ethics meet and where they coincide, then effectively that's where permaculture happens. So beyond that, there are principles that guide that go into kind of more detail about how to go about this sort of process. But ultimately, it's something that really responds to particular place quite specifically. So it's not something that actually provides a kind of broad rule that goes, right, you do this in all situations, and this is how permaculture is done. It involves various different techniques that are constantly being explored. Unfortunately, it's one of those things that is really well documented online. There's so much information online about permaculture that it's really easy to become informed about the basics of it. And now you can even do a permaculture design certificate for free online. So I think people realized that a lot of this material was kind of being passed around by people anyway, so they just made it free. So yeah, it's something that people can access quite easily, and that's precisely the point. It's about empowering people to become resilient, to connect with their planet again, to connect with their the way in which the planet provides them with food. Yeah, for me, it ticks all of the boxes in that respect.
And this is also like a clarification for our viewers that we will be discussing about actually the personal process that is entailed within making decisions that involve not only participating in permaculture, but the shift in ecological consciousness, if we can call it that, that a person goes through. In this case, Alex, that will be sharing with us about his own perspective and direct experience with regards to this. To remind our viewers, we will be also taking your questions and comments that are able to be placed through the Google event, or if you are on YouTube, just click on Be Part of the Conversation button at the bottom of your screen, and you will be able to place it there. So let's look at what got you into permaculture. What happened in your life that got you interested into it?
Well, I guess that goes back a very long way. I mean, my mother was, when I was probably a very small child, would take me to the top of hills. She'd just walk with me for hours and just go, we'd sit at the top of a hill, and she'd go, look. And I'd say to her, what? And she'd say, no, just look at the world, literally, just look at it. And I think that kind of just planted a seed, really, in a way. But I did. I started looking at the world, and I found myself, as I was growing up, constantly looking at the world and questioning it. And so things didn't quite fit. I saw the way that it was, gradually. I mean, it's only now that I really am able to fully articulate it. But I saw the way the world was being put together and how it functioned, and it just didn't seem to work properly. There were too many things that didn't seem to be necessarily, particularly things like the amount of inequality, the amount of violence and things like that take place in the world, the amount of abuse, just seemed completely unnecessary. And so really I looked at this from many different perspectives, and for several years I worked as a youth worker in Southampton, which is one of the poorest cities in the south of England, certainly, if not sort of in England as a whole, working with young people there. And that showed me kind of one side of how society works, really. The way inequality, the way we kind of are born into a system of inequality that actually prevents us from realizing the fullness of ourselves, from realizing the best of our potential. And I could see this happening in so many cases, and so I started to look at how why was this happening, and how could we actually do something to change this. And it led me in various different directions, and ultimately to doing a similar thing, but teaching young people survival skills and bushcraft, so really outdoor education, but in a quite an untamed way, really, so allowing a certain amount of risk, but also encouraging exploration, encouraging people to develop self-reliance, self-trust, self-resilience, just those sort of skills that they can then apply with themselves in any situation. And it struck me that this was something that, because bushcraft and survival from one perspective is just really kind of getting by, but it's about more than that. It's about how do we actually live successfully. And so this led me on to the idea of homesteading and then to permaculture. And so that's really kind of where I started to learn about it and started to discover what it was about.
And what is the context? Because you live in the UK, and we were discussing that it's obviously like the capital, the crib of royalty, financial crimes, and this society that is very well embedded with everything that has to do with ownership, values, and all of that. So tell us, what is the context also that you live in at the moment, and how have you also made the decisions to shift your life and make decisions that might go against the grain of what your society is actually training people to do.
Okay. Well, okay. My own personal situation in the UK, mine and my partner Charlotte, is that we live in a small house just outside London, sort of southwest of London. It's the kind of commuter area. It's a very sort of suburban area of the world. There's quite a high population in the southeast of England, really, relative to the rest of the country. And increasingly, you know, we were one of the first countries to go through an agricultural and industrial revolution in the world, really. So we've seen that concentration of the population out of the countryside and into the cities, really, and into large towns. And that's the situation now. I live in a relatively small town, but it's pretty much it's a sprawl of interconnecting towns that kind of encircle London, really. So it's a kind of a suburban mass. And it's a very expensive country to live in, particularly in terms of the price of land or property. It's a bubble, effectively, you know, in economic terms. It's something that has been kind of grossly inflated by, as we say, the city and the kind of infrastructure there. It's a really precarious situation. But it also means that very few people can actually afford to, because we have this culture in the UK of house ownership that was kind of started in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government, and so we have this kind of culture of it, and very few people can actually afford to kind of get onto what we call the housing ladder. So yeah, we've got this really bizarre economic situation that can't really be sustained. So, as I was saying earlier on, in this country, we've got 69% of the land owned by 0.6% of the population, which is a greater disparity of land ownership than in Brazil, for example. So, you know, this is kind of, this is the sort of the bastion of empire. This is where we kind of developed all of these ideas of ownership and control, really, and then we've then kind of the British culture over the years, the centuries, has promulgated that around the world. So yeah, it's from that perspective of doing anything that kind of tries to either go against or contradict or undermine that culture and that ideology, it's very challenging. And so the legislation and the laws that are in place in this country make it very, very restrictive for people to actually to do things like this, you know, to have small holdings, to do small-scale farming. The majority of farming in the UK is large-scale monoculture, industrial-scale farming, and there are organic farms, but they're quite limited in size and in what they can offer. So, what motivated me from that perspective, really, to look at making a change was really my partner and I coming to the conclusion, having gone and done a permaculture design course, and really seeing that it had something that we could really engage with, and something that we could actually use to take a new direction with our lives, that was going to have a really much more effective use of our time and much more constructive impact in terms of how we interact with and the effect that we have upon the world at large. But in this country, it's very difficult for us to do that, even if we're to sell our house here. The price of land is such that actually, because for us it's not just about doing something for ourselves and living in a kind of isolated, idyllic little bubble, you know, and shutting the rest of the world out or trying to escape. We can't do that. You know, we realise that actually we are one world. We're all fundamentally connected to it. We're, you know, inescapably connected to it, and so we have to engage with that. And so we want to find some way to use the resources that we have to engage other people, whether that be through teaching and sharing of knowledge and ideas and experience, or whether it's actually providing, you making use of that natural environment for other purposes, for example, palliative care and things like that. So there's so many different opportunities that can be offered by re-engaging with the natural environment through a system like permaculture.
It's interesting because, as you're mentioning, the system in itself is not really designed to support this kind of new movements and growing ideas, because it does entail a bit of decentralization from the perspective of you only getting your own food from the supermarkets or markets. So from that perspective, it shifts the way that the economy operates, but we will also be looking at how permaculture and this growing your own food culture can become part of businesses as well. So before I continue, there is just a comment from Grega Vimpolsek. Sorry if I don't pronounce it correctly. Yes, your comment is coming through. Welcome to the Hangout. This is your first time. So you can place comments, questions for Alex or myself. The same to Taylor Swift, who is placing a comment. Hi, back. So I remind you there are questions and comments that you can place. So let's look at first food sovereignty, because many people are talking about this. So what can you tell us in how this permaculture links to this in a subversive manner, also with regards to the system in general?
Okay. Well, I think in some ways it's important to say that actually, certainly for my part, you know, often permaculture is seen like, or can be perceived like a bit of a hippie movement. You know, that it's a bit of a lag on from the 70s and the 60s and that kind of, you know, peace and love type outlook, really, and that sort of new age spirituality. And I don't come from either that generation or that background or that outlook. I'm looking at it from a very practical perspective, and so to see it as something as a kind of subversive culture from that perspective is almost counterproductive. So it's important to look at it as something that can engage with people on at all levels, really. And when we're talking about something like food, then ultimately I think it strikes a chord with pretty much every living thing. So, you know, we all have some common ground there. Yeah, I mean, food sovereignty is really a recognition of the idea that ultimately through globalizing our trade systems, we have effectively we've globalized inequality and we've globalized poverty ultimately, and all of the suffering and abuse that goes along with that. So it's a recognition that actually as one step to re-empowering people in terms of particularly their food supply, and so being able to actually kind of control the basic necessities for life. Food being, you know, a primary one, to step back to the level of nations and to actually allow nations more or entire kind of self-determination in terms of the food that they produce. I mean, you know, if you look at a supermarket in the UK, for example, that we have, and I do this regularly when I have to go to a supermarket for any reason, I go and I look at where even just the fruit and the vegetables, where they come from. And yeah, they come from all over the world. They come from South America, they come from South Africa, they come from Europe, they come from Israel, and it's ridiculous, and it's a completely kind of false market, if you like. It's actually maintained to generate money for the corporations that control it, rather than actually empowering and generating an income for ordinary people. So food sovereignty really as a kind of an idea and a movement is really about kind of taking that power back effectively, and also the responsibility with it, of course, you know, because the rights don't come without responsibilities. But yeah, so it's from that perspective, I think it's a really important step to be taken.
It's interesting because we've talked about before in terms of sustainability, precisely to focus on local markets or food markets or farmers markets, wherein you get to know and have a relationship also with the people that are growing the food and maybe do some exchange. I mean, everything is possible when you start also getting to this community level, which is, as I've also read, an interesting and inherent part to permaculture. So how do you see this relationship of, I mean, you can grow your own food in your own house, but there's also the context of getting more in contact with the community. So what's your perspective on this?
Well, I mean, in essence, the ethics and the principles of permaculture are something you can apply to any system, any situation outside of growing food. So you can apply it to growing community as well. And in many ways, you know, that understanding of community was really taken in permaculture from looking at communities that had existed maybe long before modern civilization and had existed quite successfully. So whilst not actually kind of proposing that we try and go back to the past, as it were, it's recognizing, you know, the things that the past can actually teach us and the valuable lessons that we have in communities that did exist, you know, really quite relatively peacefully and really in quite a relationship of sort of harmony and understanding with their natural environment as well. So, yeah, I mean, it's how can I explain? It's, for me, I think it's the most effective communities have to be grown in a sense. They take time. You know, just as rejuvenating a landscape, it takes time. It requires patience. I don't, you know, we can't deny the fact that the issues that we're facing in the world at the moment are very pressing. They're very urgent. But if we do what we've historically done, which is try and rush in and kind of fix things with sort of big dramatic solutions, and you know, we may end up doing more damage in the process. And so whatever we do, we have to do carefully, and we have to do thoughtfully and with consideration and taking that time to observe. And I think observation is one of those key aspects of the permaculture design process. It's fundamental, really. It's actually taking the time to stand back and look at what's happening first before we act. So,
and in
yeah,
that
sorry,
change
carry on.
of in that change of, let's say, awareness of who you are within the environment, which is also emphasized in this ecological consciousness or ecological awareness, who you are within the environment, making the best use of it. But along with that, you have the entire values and essentially like a process of programming, indoctrination that comes from our culture that is telling you exactly the opposite of what permaculture is based on. So what kind of shifts effectively have you, in essence, integrated within yourself to be able to start veering toward living in the context of permaculture?
Well, I mean, in simple terms, I ran out of valid excuses not to. Um, that was the basics
How's
of
that?
it. Well, I mean, I I looked, you know, there are many different things that I could do with my time to earn money in many different ways, but ultimately I realized that the time that I have as me is really quite valuable because I only get to do that once, and therefore I need to make it quite effective. And so, yeah, I mean, I realized that this was the most effective thing that I could do, because ultimately what it does is it gives me the ability, the resilience and the skill to look after myself, but it also potentially gives me the time to invest in the community, both in a local and in a global sense as well. And whether that's by actually, you know, involving people within that experience and teaching people about permaculture and sharing, you know, because I don't see the whole, you know, having taught people skills before, I understand that the, you know, the sort of teacher-pupil relationship is, as an authority hierarchy, doesn't really work. You know, it's got to be a much more equal relationship. And so, really, the idea of combining teaching with community really seems to make a lot of sense. And ultimately, I think that's something that the permaculture really encourages. So, yeah, so that's the direction that I'm moving in. Really, taking the skills that I've already learned and developed through other avenues of work and experiences that I've had, and actually kind of bringing that to a point where it can be most effective.
You were mentioning about social capital, which is also what you were saying you are investing yourself, your time on. So we would like to get your perspective on how could we, for example, within the context of the living income proposal, also integrate the aspect of, you know, we live still in cities, not many people have the time to, for example, dedicate themselves to permaculture. So how would you say there can be a link, so to speak, wherein capitalism is not seen as the bad guy or just left out of the equation, and how can permaculture be integrated within that context?
Sure, sure. Well, I mean, in the urban environment, permaculture can take place just as easily as it can in the countryside, but in a different way. Things happen more vertically in cities, for example, than they do horizontally, and so you simply work with that. There are a lot of, it doesn't preclude highly technological solutions as well, certainly. It's certainly prepared to embrace technology. It's not about kind of going back to the dark ages in that respect. So things like vertical farms, for example, are quite a viable solution for communities to grow things locally in cities. I mean, in terms of the legal situation, the current world system, the economic situation, it's a question that I've been asking myself for a very, very long time and continue to ask myself every day, because we don't yet have an answer to that. I've often wondered whether we're actually going to need to get to a point where we're almost in that state of desperation before we go, oh, okay, right, let's consider some common sense solutions here. Let's consider some practical solutions and let's actually get involved. Or whether it's actually more of a question of just kind of building a critical mass. I mean, I've heard it said that really, in order to build a critical mass of any kind of idea to permeate an entire group or an entire society, it needs only between about 11 and 18% of that population to take it on board, and then it will just simply become the overwhelming idea. So I think in that respect, I think it's important to push for changes in the fundamental economic system, the fundamental legislation, and so where living income guarantee comes in, it makes a sound proposal to say, right, this is an alternative system that can function really, really well. And I think where permaculture comes into that really is as part of that process, but also in the meantime of kind of building in. It has the ability on a very local and kind of quiet and small scale to build in resilience to human beings. So because, in making this transition from the system that we've known for a very, very long time, really, through the feudal system and right the way through to our modern system now, it's still the same kind of sort of pyramid-based structure principle. So, it's going to take time to make that transition, and I think we have to do that with an amount of kind of care, really, in what we're doing. And so, what I think permaculture can offer is actually kind of nurturing that strength and that sense of resilience and durability within people, so that they can actually successfully make that transition without freaking out.
I agree, because living income would essentially give this safety net wherein you can actually go test it out, apply the principles, do the actual work that is required within permaculture, and still not freak out because, oh, you've left everything behind and now you have no safety net. So there you have also, for example, people that don't have the amount of hours that it would require to educate themselves or attend courses or education because they have to work extended hours, take care of children, etc. So it would give you, for example, the ability to work less and start educating yourself on permaculture or any other type of solution that is required to, as I fully agree with you, kind of expand that awareness of we are a collective, let's look at other solutions, let's change the paradigm while having this undercurrent or safety net of getting a living income. If you want to lower your workload, for example. So I'd like to ask you, go ahead.
I was just going to say, having sort of read through the living income guarantee proposal, there's an interesting bit in there that talks about automation of a lot of production processes.
Yes.
And potentially that could apply to agriculture as well, depending on how we do it. However, I think that there's also an important role that human beings play in the sense of our ability to become more connected with our natural environment, that we can actually become quite effective in that respect. So, I think that there's an interesting kind of way of redefining our relationship to our planet that puts us on an equal footing with nature ultimately. Yeah, sorry, I kind of lost my thread slightly with that point, but yeah, carry on.
I'd like to ask you about the sustainability of it, because this might be something that people can be asking themselves, like, okay, are you growing your own food already? Is it sustainable? Are you already not buying anything from the supermarket? What's the practicality right now?
The situation right now is that we have a house with a little backyard out the back that backs onto a railway track. There's a tiny little bit of space, and in that I grow some herbs, and I have a few little pots of things growing in the space that there is. It doesn't get a lot of sun, so it's not the most ideal position. In terms of how we try to apply common sense in how we live, in terms of trying to kind of live frugally and as efficiently as we can. So, for example, we're heating our house with a wood stove rather than using the electricity to heat it when we can, for example, when it's necessary. But ultimately, in this country, we're still, for the majority of people, we're still very much kind of dependent upon the supply systems of the supermarkets and things like that. And we can, I mean, if I have to go to a supermarket or I go to a shop to buy food, I'll try to go to a local supplier, a local producer. So I do have that option, but that tends to be more expensive. So ultimately, if you want a better quality, then you have to pay for it. And there's a massive problem there for me, because that's not something that's actually accessible to everybody. I mean, for me, it's fundamentally important that if one person can have something of exceptional quality and have really healthy food, then it's important that we can do that for everyone.
Yes, and part of our proposal is also to make of the best quality food something that is affordable to everyone, not only because they will be getting a living income or higher wages, but because it should be made that way. Currently, it has become like a fad, or only some people that have extra money can buy all organics and so forth, which should be not a division that exists like non-organic and organic. Everything should be organic and the best possible, with the best possible nutritional value as well, which currently is quite questionable when we have large corporations in that. So I would like to ask you about the educational process that is involved within this. And when reading about permaculture, it's obvious that there are very interesting and, I would say, indispensable principles that apply, as you were mentioning, not only to growing your own food or designing in an ecological manner, but in the way that we relate to one another. So what's your perspective on how could we integrate these principles, tenets in the education system, for example, or do you have any other idea?
I mean, it would be interesting, because the current education system is obviously set up to service the economic system, really, isn't it? Is to supply people that will be workers effectively and function within that system. So it would be a challenge from that perspective, because it's a threat to economic interests as they currently stand, to change the education system in that respect. But assuming that it were possible, if I can give an example, when I would have groups of young people come out to the forest where I was working, teaching bushcraft and survival skills, and we would be doing activities throughout the day, often quite active, quite sort of loud and active. I'm trying to think of what we were doing, sort of archery and things like that, or they'd be climbing trees, or and then in the evening time, we would walk out into the middle of the woods and get them together in pairs, and they'd just sit them down in individual spots and just say, right, for the next 15 minutes, just look and just listen to what's happening around you. And the effect that that had ultimately was, it just, because often we were working with kids that were kind of classified as having conditions like ADHD and things like that, so they were often taking medication and things like Ritalin, and they were literally bouncing off the trees sometimes. So we'd take them into the woods and we'd sit them down and say, right, okay, so we're just going to watch and we're going to listen for 10 minutes, which is a long time when you're a kid. We're going to see all the animals coming out. We're going to see you know, the different sounds and the different things happening if we start to pay attention, we start to really notice what's going on in this environment. And through doing things like that, it really dawned on me that the natural environment is probably the best classroom environment possible, because you have all of the teaching tools to teach people about, you know, because before we start to teach people about the abstract, you know, when I was a kid, I was looking out of the window all the time. I was never paying attention to what was going on in class. It was more interesting what was going on out the window. And it is to all children, you know, when they're out in a natural environment, suddenly you can see that it's completely normal to them. Do you know what I mean? It's the kind of wildness in them comes out, the natural human being in them comes out, and to teach people about their world in context is really essential to actually have a full understanding, and for young people as children, as they grow up, to really get that sense that they are fundamentally connected to their entire environment. So yeah, for me it would be a much more grounding approach to education than that which we currently have.
And an absolutely basic skill, I would say, because, you know, food is what you require to eat, the same as water and air. So I would say that it is definitely something that we also propose in terms of changing or integrating it within the education system. We have a comment question from Grega, so let's read it. You can also click on your Q&A icon to read it as well.
Okay.
Isn't city permaculture a paradox? I think that permaculture is humans living in harmony with nature in nature. I mean, ecological infrastructure and biological organic food production. So that is nearly impossible for common people.
It's interesting. I mean, my response to that, for my part, the way I see it, is that if we define and perceive human beings as being distinctly separate from nature, then ultimately we're setting a kind of precedent that may continue to separate us from nature in the future. So ultimately, really, we have to accept that where we are now, we have to accept that cities exist. You know, we are where we are, and so we have to work with what is. We have to work with what's here. So the thing about permaculture is that it is an adaptable design system. It can be applied to any environment. It can be applied as much in a desert as it can in the middle of a city as it can in a jungle. So I think that's the value in it. So I don't see that as necessarily a paradox at all, even though it may in time change the need for cities. It may change the focus of human beings in terms of how they want to live. But we can't suddenly abandon all of the cities as they are and just suddenly try and create a life in the countryside. It wouldn't work. You know, we'd have kind of chaos and land grabs going on and things like that. So yeah, we'd be in Wild West times. I don't think that would work out. But I've seen a lot of really interesting things taking place in cities in terms of really small scale community gardens, things like that, still using permaculture principles, and perhaps you could argue actually more effectively than a lot of these more kind of new age movements are perhaps doing out in the middle of nowhere, you know, in sort of some kind of Shangri-La paradise, really.
Right.
It's for me, it's really important, and it may well be that having gone to different countries after we've left here, you know, sold our house and left here, I may end up back here working in an urban environment doing exactly that, because I think, you know, that's where the majority of people are. So ultimately, if you're doing it in that environment, you're going to actually get it noticed by a larger proportion of people. You can actually get more people to communicate to and get them to respond to that than you can by trying to get them to come to a very sparsely populated area, you know?
And it's already going on. I mean, there, as you were mentioning, community gardens, even they exist in New York City. So I wouldn't also call it a paradox, but more of an integration to the urban context that can be done and tested out. And ultimately you have to ask yourself, why do cities exist? And that it's because of the industrial centers where jobs are given. But if you start integrating this context of dedicating yourself to permaculture, then that might shift, but we cannot really ascertain anything for sure for now. She's saying also, even state won't allow this in majority. I think this is possible for someone living or buying a small farm near the forest, for example.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've been really aware of that. I've asked myself this question. I've been very critical with myself and very questioning of myself in terms of my motivations for doing what I'm doing, because I'm not trying to go down that route of sort of stepping out of the world system, as it were, and trying to kind of live outside of that. It's simply impossible, and doing all the different things that I've done and seen the aspects of society that I've seen, I simply can't do that. So, and in the same sense, permaculture is a tool. So I'm not sort of, I use that as a tool, so rather than kind of dedicating myself to it. And there are many people that, it almost has become like almost a religious fervor, really, and that word has taken on religious proportions, but it's just a word. So it's actually, for me, it's actually about dedicating yourself to life and realizing that you as life are all of it, really. What you do, it's cause and effect. What you do is really going to echo through the entire world. So, it's about taking responsibility for that.
Yes, and cooperating instead of just contributing to its destruction, like placing your grain of salt into growing something bigger. If it becomes like a natural practice or something that we can actually see it as a viable option or as a hobby, So I agree very much on everything that you've said in relation to how it's currently perceived as this religious context, which is, I would say, too far-fetched. It can be just taken for the practicality that it is as a tool. So we have other question from Valentin Rosman. He's saying, cool hangout. I have watched a few documentaries about SelfHalsa, and he also had a few workshops here in Slovenia. I find his approach very fresh, with minimum time and effort investment for maximum outcome. Are you familiar with him?
Yeah, SelfHalsa is. I'm not sure whether he's Austrian or Swiss, but he was a farmer who he's credited with really developing permaculture in practical terms. So really, on the ground, developing as a practical system before it was ever developed in theory. So yeah, I mean, he's really got some of the most fundamental practical knowledge of how this can work, and I have a lot of time for the way that he teaches, and really anybody that kind of teaches from that really grounded practical perspective. It's about teaching with dirt under your nails ultimately, rather than in some sort of sterile, detached way. And similarly, as we were saying before, just not going down that kind of fluffy, slightly spiritual route, but actually keeping things, grounded in a practical way that actually then everybody from any background can relate to and can understand and appreciate the value of.
Cool. We have another one from Jeanne Kenney. She's saying, what contribute to your realization that we need to work with what is here and build on the existing infrastructure?
Well, it's not so much a question of a point of building on the existing infrastructure, but it's more a question of being able to change things by working with what is here. So really, in simple terms, it's more a question of acceptance, really, rather than trying to fight against the system and to resist it. But ultimately, when we fight against something and we resist it, we give more power to it, really. In some convoluted way, we actually give it more strength as something that is against us, and so we need to engage with it. Ultimately, we are the system. The system is human beings. We are the creators of it and the perpetuators of it every day, every moment. So, we're just simply engaging with each other. We're engaging with ourselves on that human level and saying, right, okay, what are we actually going to do? How are we going to deal with this?
Fully agree with that. We have another question from Red Dalmas, and she's saying, have you heard of the urban homesteaders?
I'm not sure, possibly, but I have seen some really interesting stuff on YouTube with people doing things in garden-sized spaces, and it is amazing what you can do. I mean, in an average size, certainly perhaps not so much in this country, but in the United States, people tend to have larger gardens, and with a garden that size, you could certainly provide enough food for maybe the next 2 houses either side as well as yourself. So it's a really, really interesting possibility, and actually it makes me think of an idea I had a little while ago, looking at the way that houses are built in the United Kingdom, because it's obviously quite a densely populated country in terms of the populated areas, not the big privately owned bits of land and shooting estates and things like that. But it's the houses are kind of built, side by side, up next to each other, and the roads back onto each other, so the gardens kind of back onto each other from each house. And it occurred to me that it would be interesting if you could actually get people to a point where they were prepared to take down their garden walls and fences and actually use that space collectively to provide food for themselves. Which is, in a practical sense, it seemed to make a lot of common sense. But then I thought about it from another perspective, which was, how are you actually going to get those people who may not necessarily have spoken to each other before, may even not have wanted to engage with each other before, just live behind closed doors, to venture out from their caves, as it were, and come into this open space and actually start to negotiate this activity with each other? I mean, within that, you've got the potential to build community, and then it's a question of, right, how do you go about doing that?
I would say that necessity will actually push people to start considering those aspects. I've actually considered that in the environment that I live in, and I would say, well, what could push us to do this kind of decisions? Necessity. Just seeing like, okay, there's no other option, let's move and work together. There's no need to get to that position. We could do it beforehand, but I would say that that's what could drive us to do it. Thanks for your question, Rev. We have a comment from Anna Briggs Thompson, and she's saying, thanks a lot for this hangout, inspiring and important message shared. Thanks for the work you do and sharing your passion. I fully agree with that.
Thank you. Cheers.
So any last words for this hangout, maybe to also, as Anna was saying, continue inspiring or plant a seed of initiative for people to consider taking a look at or participating in permaculture? What have you learned? What have you changed also in your life in relation to it?
Well, I mean, it's although I'm still in that process, really, it's prompted me to change fundamentally almost everything about my life, really. So I'm effectively stopping my life as it currently functions and exists, and I'm then putting myself in a position where I can look at how to redesign the way I live effectively. In terms of inspiring other people, I mean, it's certainly something that I'm hoping to make a fundamental part of what I do in the future. I've thought about the possibility of actually trying, documenting, with video, for example, documenting this process of actually making this change, and then, what's involved in the personal experience of it, as a way of actually showing that it is possible. I mean, there are other people that have done this as well, but I think it's important that as many people do this as they can, really. So it's quite important to, if you have a voice, to use it, really. Yeah, I mean, for other people, I would say, look, there's so much information out there online. Literally, it's one of those things. Permaculture is something that is really, really quite well documented online, particularly on YouTube. As I said before, there are permaculture design certificate courses that can be done online now. Jeff Lawton, who was a student of Bill Mollison, has a course that he offers free online, and there are others as well. And then ultimately, I think that it's really just a question of literally rolling your sleeves up and getting your hands dirty. It's one of those things that really encourages you to get out there and really start doing things. And as it explains in the process, and seeing, if you look at it, you'll see that it really can be done on any scale. So small scale, large scale, it really doesn't matter. So yeah, it's really about putting it's about really discovering how you can use that for yourself. So it's something that you can actually use to design things for you.
I like the fact that it's something that all of us can do, and as you've shared, it is a matter of having the initiative to do it, and that's what I like about it, the flexibility with which you present it. So thanks a lot, Alex, for sharing with us. It's been very inspiring, of course.
Thanks very much, Marlen.
And to everyone watching, if you have further comments, questions for Alex, you can place them in the YouTube comment if you didn't catch the live transmission, and we will ensure that he gets to them. And so see you next time in another Hangout next week. Thanks a lot, Alex. And we will probably get back to you in some time to come to see how's it going and developing on your side. Thanks for sharing it.
That would be great. Okay, thanks very much, Marlen. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.